When shadows fall, the gallery walls shimmered under soft amber lights, each painting a window into worlds both familiar and strange. Guests moved through the space like ghosts, their whispers blending with the quiet hum of classical music. The center of it all stood Vincent Cross, a man whose presence commanded attention without demanding it. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like armor, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples. Art critic, philanthropist, and reluctant celebrity, Vincent had built his reputation on seeing beauty where others saw only chaos. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, the gallery showcased works by emerging artists, and Vincent had agreed to speak about the intersection of vulnerability and strength in modern art. He stood near a canvas splashed with crimson and gold, his eyes distant, his mind somewhere else entirely. 5 years ago, he had lost his daughter in a car accident. She had been only 12, bright as summer, full of dreams about becoming a dancer. Since then, Vincent had walked through life like a man underwater, breathing but never quite alive. Across the room, Natalie Brooks adjusted the strap of her camera bag and studied the crowd. She was a documentary photographer, lean and sharp-eyed, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her work focused on people in moments of transition, grief turning to hope, despair becoming determination. She had come tonight not for the art on the walls, but for the people who stood before it. Faces told stories that words could not capture. Her lens found Vincent almost immediately. There was something about him, a gravity that pulled focus. She watched as he touched his wrist absently, where a thin scar traced along his pulse. A nervous habit, perhaps, or a memory worn into flesh. Natalie moved closer, weaving through the crowd, her camera silent at her side. She had learned long that the best photographs came not from asking permission, but from waiting for the world to forget you were watching. Vincent began his speech, his voice low and measured. He spoke about how art reflected not what we see, but what we fear to lose. The crowd listened, captivated, but Natalie noticed the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the edge of the podium as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. This was a man holding himself together by sheer will. Then it happened. Midway through a sentence about color and memory, Vincent paused. His face went pale, his breathing shallow. He pressed a hand to his chest, his eyes widening in confusion and pain. The crowd murmured, uncertain whether this was part of the performance or something else. Natalie lowered her camera. She knew that look. She had seen it once before, years ago, when her father collapsed at the dinner table. Heart attack. Vincent stumbled forward, his knees buckling. People gasped. Some reached out, but fear made them hesitate. Natalie did not hesitate. She pushed through the circle of onlookers and caught him as he fell, easing him to the floor. His weight was heavier than she expected, solid and real. She cradled his head in her lap, her fingers finding his pulse. It was there, but faint, fluttering like a trapped bird. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Another person fumbled with their phone. Natalie ignored them all. She leaned close to Vincent, her face inches from his, and spoke quietly. "Stay with me. Do not close your eyes." He tried to focus on her, his lips moving without sound. His skin was cold, clammy. She could see the light fading from his gaze, the way people looked when they started to let go. Without thinking, Natalie did something she had only read about in emergency training manuals. She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and pressed her mouth to his. Rescue breathing. 2 quick breaths, steady and firm. His chest rose and fell beneath her hands. She pulled back, checking for response. Nothing. She breathed again, pouring air into his lungs, willing him to fight. The third time something changed. Vincent's body jerked slightly. His eyes flew open, wide and startled. He gasped, sucking in air like a drowning man breaking the surface. Natalie pulled back, her heart pounding, her hand still pressed against his chest. For a long moment they stared at each other, 2 strangers bound by the strange intimacy of survival. Vincent blinked, disoriented. "You," he whispered. "Who are you?" Natalie smiled faintly, brushing hair from her face. Someone who does not let people die in art galleries. His lips twitched, almost a smile. Good policy. The paramedics arrived minutes later, efficient and brisk. They lifted Vincent onto a stretcher, checking vitals, asking questions. Natalie stepped back, her hands trembling now that the crisis had passed. One of the paramedics glanced at her. "You saved his life." She shook her head. "I just bought him time." As they wheeled Vincent toward the exit, he turned his head, searching the crowd until he found her. "Thank you," he mouthed. Natalie nodded, unable to speak. She watched the ambulance doors close, watched the red lights disappear into the night. Around her, the gallery buzzed with shock and speculation. Someone asked if she was all right. She nodded again, though she was not sure it was true. Her camera hung forgotten at her side. For once, she had not been an observer. She had been part of the story. Later that night, alone in her small apartment overlooking the river, Natalie sat by the window and stared at the city lights. She kept thinking about Vincent's eyes, the way they had looked at her in that final moment before he collapsed. There had been recognition there, not of her, but of something. A choice, perhaps. To give up or to keep fighting. She thought about her father, how she had been too young to help him, too scared to act. She had watched him die while adults shouted and fumbled. Tonight she had not been helpless. Tonight she had done something that mattered. But she also knew that saving someone once did not mean they were safe. Life was more complicated than that. Vincent Cross was alive, but what kind of life awaited him? And why did she care so much about a stranger whose name she had only learned from the event program? Across the city, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, Vincent lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The doctors had stabilized him, told him he was lucky, that he needed rest and tests and lifestyle changes. He heard the words but did not absorb them. All he could think about was the woman with the camera, the one who had breathed life back into him when he was ready to let go. He remembered her face, fierce and focused, framed by loose strands of hair. He remembered the warmth of her breath, the strength in her hands. He did not know her name, but he knew she had given him something more than air. She had reminded him that the world still held people who acted without hesitation, who chose courage over fear. And for the first time in 5 years, Vincent wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was not finished yet. Outside his window, the city hummed with life. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman sat by her own window, thinking about a man she had saved, and the strange unspoken connection that now stretched between them like a thread pulled taut, waiting to see if it would hold or break. The space between heartbeats. 3 days passed before Natalie saw Vincent again. She had not planned to visit the hospital, but the image of his face, pale and struggling, kept surfacing in her mind like a photograph developing in a darkroom. She told herself it was professional curiosity, that perhaps there was a story worth documenting in recovery and resilience. But as she walked through the hospital corridors, carrying a small bag of books she thought he might like, she knew the truth was more complicated. Vincent was sitting up when she entered his room, a newspaper folded in his lap, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the formal armor he had worn at the gallery. His hospital gown was plain, his hair uncombed, but his eyes still carried that same quiet intensity. When he saw her, surprise flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been relief. "You came," he said simply. Natalie shrugged, setting the bag on the table beside his bed. "I wanted to make sure my emergency breathing skills actually worked." He smiled, a real smile this time, and gestured to the chair beside him. "Please sit. The doctors tell me I owe you my life." She sat, feeling suddenly awkward. "They would have revived you anyway." "Maybe," he said, "but you were the one who refused to let me go. That matters." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with things neither knew how to say. Natalie glanced around the room, noting the absence of flowers or get-well cards. "No family?" she asked gently. Vincent's expression tightened. "My wife died 7 years ago. Cancer, and my daughter. She paused, looking down at his hands 5 years ago. Car accident. I was driving. Natalie's chest constricted. I'm so sorry. He shook his head slowly. Grief is a strange companion. It never leaves, but you learn to walk with it. Some days are easier than others. He looked at her then, really looked at her. What about you? Why does a photographer spend her time saving strangers? Natalie hesitated, then decided honesty was the only currency that mattered here. My father had a heart attack when I was 14. I froze. I did not know what to do, and by the time someone who did arrived, it was too late. I swore I would never be that helpless again. Vincent nodded slowly. So we are both haunted. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose we are. Over the following weeks, Natalie found herself returning to the hospital more often than she intended. She told herself it was because Vincent had no one else, but the truth was more selfish. Talking to him felt like peeling back layers of her own armor, examining wounds she had kept hidden for years. He spoke about his daughter, Lily, about her laugh and her terrible jokes and the way she used to dance in the kitchen while making breakfast. Natalie shared stories about her father, about his love of old westerns and his habit of humming while he worked. They traded grief like currency, each story a small offering of trust, and slowly something unexpected began to grow between them. Not romance exactly, but a kind of recognition. The way two people who have walked through fire understand each other without needing to explain the scars. One afternoon, Vincent was finally discharged. Natalie offered to drive him home, and he accepted without hesitation. His apartment was in an older building downtown, filled with books and art and photographs that spoke of a life once full. He made tea while she wandered through the rooms, studying the frames on the walls. One photograph stopped her cold. It showed a young girl in a ballet costume mid-leap, her face lit with pure joy. Lily, Vincent said from behind her. That was taken a month before the accident. Natalie turned to him, seeing the pain carved into his features. She was beautiful. She was everything, he whispered. After she died, I thought about ending it all. But I could not do that to her memory. So I kept going, kept working, kept pretending I was alive. Until the night at the gallery, when my heart decided it had had enough of pretending. Natalie set down her teacup and moved closer to him. Vincent, you are not pretending anymore. You are here. You are breathing. That is not nothing. He looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Why do you care so much about a broken man you barely know? Because, she said softly, I know what it is like to feel responsible for someone's death, and I know that carrying that weight alone will crush you. The silence that followed was profound. Then Vincent did something unexpected. He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. Thank you, he said, not for saving my life, but for reminding me it is worth living. Natalie squeezed his hand back, feeling the pulse beneath his skin, steady and strong. We save each other, she said. That is how this works. As the days turned into weeks, their friendship deepened. Natalie introduced Vincent to her world, taking him on photography walks through the city, showing him how to see beauty in rust and shadow, in the faces of people rushing past. He began to smile more, to laugh at small things, to talk about the future as though it were something real rather than abstract. And Natalie found herself letting go of old guilt, learning that forgiveness was not about forgetting, but about choosing to move forward. One evening, they stood on a bridge overlooking the river, watching the sun set in shades of amber and rose. Vincent turned to her, his expression serious. I need to tell you something. That night at the gallery when I collapsed, I had decided earlier that day to stop taking my medication. I was tired, Natalie. Tired of waking up every morning and remembering what I had lost. I thought if my heart gave out, it would be easier than choosing to end things myself. Natalie felt her breath catch. But then I saw you, he continued, standing there with your camera, looking at the world like it still held wonder. And I thought, maybe I have been looking at the wrong things. Maybe there is still something worth seeing. She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. You cannot put that on me, Vincent. I am not your reason to live, he shook his head gently. You are not my reason, you are my reminder. There is a difference. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch tentative. You breathed life into me when I was ready to let go. Now I want to learn how to breathe on my own again. Natalie leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his palms against her skin. Then we learned together, she whispered. They stood there as the light faded, two people bound not by romance but by something deeper. by the shared understanding that life was fragile and fierce and worth fighting for. And in that moment, beneath the vast indifferent sky, they made a silent promise to each other, to keep going, to keep seeing, to keep choosing life even when it hurt, even when it was hard, even when the ghosts of the past whispered that letting go would be easier. Because sometimes survival is not about being strong. It is about finding someone who will hold your hand in the darkness and remind you that morning always comes. Breathing forward 6 months later, Natalie stood in a small gallery downtown surrounded by her own work. The exhibition was called Resilience, a collection of photographs documenting people in moments of transition. There were images of refugees building new homes, of athletes recovering from injury, of families reuniting after years apart. But the centerpiece, the photograph that drew the most attention, was a portrait of Vincent. In the image, he sat by a window, light streaming across his face, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. It was a quiet photograph, almost meditative, but there was something in his expression that spoke of peace hard won. Beneath the frame, a small placard read, "The moment after choosing to stay." Vincent stood beside her now, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You captured something I did not know was visible," he said softly. "What is that?" she asked. "Hope," he replied. "Real hope, not the forced kind." The gallery was filled with people, friends and strangers alike, moving through the space with reverence. Natalie watched them pause before each image, saw their faces soften with recognition. This was why she did this work, not to document pain, but to honor the courage it took to move beyond it. Vincent had taught her that. He had shown her that survival was not a passive act, but an active choice made every single day. Since that night on the bridge, their lives had become intertwined in unexpected ways. Vincent had started volunteering at a grief support group, sharing his story with others who were drowning in loss. Natalie joined him sometimes, photographing the sessions with permission, capturing the raw honesty of people learning to live again. Together they created a project called After, a documentary series about life beyond tragedy. The work was hard, emotionally exhausting, but it was also healing. Natalie found that by witnessing other people's pain, she could finally make peace with her own. And Vincent discovered that by helping others carry their grief, his own burden became lighter. They were not fixing each other, but they were walking the same path, and that made all the difference. One evening, after a particularly difficult session, they sat together in Vincent's apartment, drinking tea and watching the city lights flicker. "I never thought I would feel this way again," Vincent said quietly. "Feel what way?" Natalie asked. "Alive," he replied. "Truly, deeply alive. Not just going through the motions, but actually feeling things. Joy, sadness, anger, love. All of it." Natalie smiled, reaching for his hand. "That is what happens when you stop running from the pain. You make room for everything else, too." Vincent squeezed her fingers gently. "I could not have done this without you." She shook her head. "You did this yourself. I just reminded you that you could." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from knowing someone deeply. Eventually, Vincent spoke again, his voice hesitant. "I want to show you something." He stood and walked to a drawer, pulling out a small wooden box. Inside was a collection of letters, yellowed with age. "These are letters Lily wrote me," he said. "She used to leave them around the house, little notes telling me she loved me or thanking me for making pancakes. I could not read them for years. Every time I tried, I felt like I was drowning." He handed one to Natalie. "But last week I read them all. And instead of drowning, I felt like I was floating, because I realized that love does not die with the person. It stays, transformed into memory and gratitude." Natalie unfolded the letter carefully. It was written in a child's handwriting, messy but earnest. "Dear Dad, thank you for teaching me that falling is part of learning to fly. I love you to the moon and back, Lily." Tears blurred Natalie's vision. "She's still with you," she whispered. Vincent nodded, his own eyes wet. "Yes. And I think she would be proud of the man I am becoming." Natalie wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "She is proud. I'm sure of it." As the months continued to pass, their project gained attention. After was featured in magazines and online platforms, sparking conversations about grief and recovery. People reached out to share their own stories, creating a community of survivors who refused to be defined by their losses. Natalie and Vincent became advocates, speaking at conferences and schools, teaching others that it was okay to not be okay, but also that it was okay to find joy again. Their bond deepened in ways neither had anticipated. It was not romantic, though there was love between them, deep and abiding. It was the kind of love that came from truly seeing someone, scars and all, and choosing to stand beside them anyway. They celebrated each other's victories and held space for each other's breakdowns. They laughed at stupid jokes and cried over old memories. They built a life together that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. 1 year after that night at the gallery, they returned to the same space for an anniversary exhibition. This time, the walls were filled with photographs from the after project, images of people who had survived unimaginable loss and found ways to keep going. Vincent gave a speech, his voice steady and clear. He talked about his daughter, about the accident, about the years he spent wishing he could disappear. And then he talked about the night he almost got his wish. But I did not disappear, he said, looking directly at Natalie, because someone refused to let me go. And in that refusal I found permission to choose life again. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the audience. We all have the power to be that person for someone else, to see their pain and not look away, to breathe hope into spaces where despair has taken root. That is what it means to be human. Not to avoid suffering, but to face it together. The applause was thunderous, but Natalie barely heard it. She was too busy wiping tears from her cheeks, too overwhelmed by gratitude for this man who had taught her that saving someone's life was not a one-time act, but a continuous choice to show up, to be present, to love without expectation. After the event, they walked through the city streets side by side, two people who had found each other in the darkest moment and chose to build light together. The night air was cool, filled with the sounds of traffic and distant laughter. Vincent stopped suddenly, turning to face her. I need to say something, and I need you to really hear it. Natalie nodded, her heart beating faster. What is it? You did not just save my life that night, Vincent said, his voice thick with emotion. You saved my soul. You reminded me that I was worth saving, that my story was not finished. And every day since then, you have shown me what it means to be brave. Not fearless, but brave. Choosing to keep going even when it is hard. Choosing to open your heart even when it has been broken. You are the strongest person I know, Natalie Brooks, and I am honored to walk this path with you. Natalie felt her own tears fall freely now. We walk it together, she said. That is the only way it works. Vincent pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly. They stood there beneath the streetlights. Two survivors who had learned that healing was not about erasing the past, but about weaving it into a future that honored both the pain and the beauty of being alive. In that moment, Natalie understood something profound. When she had breathed life into Vincent that night at the gallery, she had also breathed life into herself. By refusing to let him die, she had refused to let her own story end in guilt and regret. They had saved each other, not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent acts of showing up. And that, she realized, was the truest form of love. As they walked home through the city, Natalie thought about all the people whose photographs lined the walls of the gallery. Each one was a testament to the human capacity for resilience, for choosing hope even in the face of impossible odds. And she knew that their stories, like hers and Vincent's, would continue to inspire others to keep breathing, keep fighting, keep choosing life. Because in the end, survival is not about avoiding darkness. It is about finding the courage to strike a match when the shadows close in. It is about reaching for someone's hand and holding on. Even when letting go seems easier, it is about breathing, one moment at a time until those moments become days and those days become a life worth living. And sometimes, when you are very lucky, you find someone who will breathe with you through every storm and every sunrise, reminding you that you are not alone, that you never have to be alone again.